In this episode, we're setting up fire and explosion damage for both our AI character and our player character. Hey guys, today we're setting up our fire gameplay abilities to do fire damage. And really we have two different kinds of fire damage with these gameplay abilities that we've set up already. So one is going to be regular old fire damage. You get hit, you get burnt. And the second kind is going to be explosion damage, and that's going to have a physical force component. But luckily we've already set up all the infrastructure for doing damage based on physical force, and we did that back in episodes 42 and 44, and that's going to make this episode really easy. And so for both of them we're going to end up using a point damage event. And initially for the explosion I was thinking we would need radial damage, but the way we're handling explosions is just doing a lot of line traces outward, and because of that the point damage event worked really well, and I think it's also more performant than using a radial damage event. And I also thought about this episode maybe doing some damage over time effects, like the character could actually catch on fire, but I figured to start we'll keep it simple, and in the future we might do more advanced stuff like that. So here are the key concepts for this episode, and although we're only going to do it for a single bone, we're going to do it for our head. You're going to know by the end of this episode how to increase damage based on the closest bone hit, like based on proximity to whatever you're hitting. And that's what we're using the switch on name node for. So let's get to it. Alright, so we're going to start with a quick recap on all the damage setup that we set up back in episode 42. So for that, we've got to go into our content drawer, back to core, our BP third person character. And on the event graph, I'm just going to zoom out. Come up here to event any damage. So back in episode 42, we set up basically impact damage, like our character slamming into something at full speed. And that passes in damage via the event any damage, damage taken. We do current health minus damage taken, and that resets our current health. And then if our current health is less than 0, this is false, and that's going to be death, but we'll cover that next episode. If our current health is greater than 0, then we do a took damage sound effect. We do a facial animation based on the damage that was taken. And some of this stuff we did subsequent to episode 42. So for example, this is episode 43 where we did a post-process effect that creates a damage effect around our screen. And then after that, what it does is it pauses the timer that increments our health automatically slowly across time. And after 5 seconds of not taking damage, then it unpauses that timer, and then the character can begin regaining health. So we're going to use all of this same setup for our fire damage, and that's the flamethrower as well as the fireball. Now for both of those things, we're going to use a different kind of damage event, and that's going to be what's called point damage. But whenever you do any kind of damage, this event any damage is called, so that means that all of this stuff is going to apply to any kind of damage that is taken in our game. But today it's all about fire damage, so we're going to start in our flamethrower. So let's go back to our content drawer, back to content, and under blueprints we're going to go into our gameplay abilities and a gameplay ability fire. So we'll need this open in order to set up our flamethrower damage, but even before that we're going to create something called a damage type. So if we go back to the content drawer, I'm going to go back to blueprints, and I'm going to create a new folder called damage. So right click, new folder, damage, and go into that. And then right click in here, we'll do a new blueprint class, and the parent class is going to be damage type. So there's different damage types that we can have in the game, but by default there's just a generic damage type. So this is going to be our fire damage type. So we'll select that, and we'll name this fire damage. And we'll double click to go into it. And the only thing that's in this blueprint are some things in the details panel here, like damage impulse, destructible impulse. And to be honest, I haven't really messed with these. I haven't gotten them working at all, but what we're going to do is for fire damage, it's not going to have any impulse. So I'm just going to set this to 0 to be safe. Same with destructible impulse, 0. And we'll compile and save our damage type. The important thing here is now we have a damage type for fire damage, which we'll be able to differentiate from explosion damage, which we'll set up for the fireball in the second half of this episode. So we'll close out of this. We'll go back to our third person character. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out here, everything from here over to the end of here. So the took damage screen effect right here. We're going to collapse all of that to a function. So right click, collapse to function. And we're going to rename this assess any damage. And I'm going to categorize that under received damage. And the reason that we're collapsing it to a function, one, it's simplifying things, but two, that means we can call it for other damage types. So what I'm going to do is move all these in. So if you got all this, if it looks just like that, then you should be all set for now. Let's go into assess any damage. And let's just straighten that out a little bit. All right, looking good. Compile and save. And you'll see the reason that we're using this function now in multiple places, but that's coming up in a little bit. So now let's go over to our gameplay ability fire. And you heard me say that we're starting with the flamethrower. So we got to figure out where in this function the flamethrower is actually going to do damage. And if we go back to the event graph, zoom out a little bit. So coming down here, we have this event receive particle data and then the fire decal update. And what this is doing, if we double click to go into that, I think we set this up all the way back in episode 29. But basically it's doing a line trace from our hand R socket to wherever the Niagara system hit. And then it's checking to see, okay, is there a decal already there? Like, is there a burn decal already there? And if there is, then darken decal. And then if not, it does a second trace and there it's actually spawning a fire decal. And initially I was thinking with the second line trace here that we could just get the hit actor, like whatever we hit, and we could check to see, is it a character? But I ran into trouble with that because if we go back to our third person character, so both the capsule component, if you go into the capsule and you scroll down a little bit, the collision presets are set to pawn and visibility is set to ignore there. And then also if I select the mesh, like if we're trying to hit the actual mesh, it's the same thing. So under collision presets here, visibility still set to ignore. And we did that for other reasons earlier in the series when we were running into some problems with collisions. And so I decided, let's not mess with that. So for the gameplay ability fire, I realized, wait, we already have a custom collision channel that we created. And that was back in episode 29 where we created this. And we never want to have decals spawn on characters because decals just sit there and the characters can move. And whenever a decal's on the character, it just doesn't look right if the character's moving in a particular direction. So if we're never having decals on the character, couldn't we use the same trace channel and just set this to register not on the capsule, but on the mesh? And the reason why I wanted to register on the mesh is because then when it hits the mesh instead of the capsule, we can get the bone. We can get the part of the body that's actually being hit. And we can say, okay, if you're hitting the head, do more damage on the head. If you're hitting the arm, do less damage because it's just an arm. We're not going to get that elaborate this episode, but it'll give us the potential to do that. So what we're going to do under the mesh, under third person character here, I'm going to change the collision presets here so that decal is not set to ignore. Decal is set to block. So we'll compile and save this. And once the mesh is registering decal collision responses, then we can go back to the gameplay ability fire. And what we're going to do is if cast to fire decal BP fails here, then we're going to attempt to cast to BP third person character because all of our characters are inheriting from this BP third person character class. So we can get our hit actor here and connect this up to the object. And what I'm going to do just to organize this a little bit differently, I'm going to move the darken decal up here, move this cast to BP third person character just in line with cast to fire decal BP. Okay, now, so if this cast succeeds, that means that our hit actor here for this line trace by channel, it's hitting a character. And so that means what we can do is we can apply point damage. And we're going to use this apply point damage instead of any damage because then we can pass in this hit from direction. And that's going to help in terms of, for example, passing in an impulse. We're not going to do that for the flamethrower because it's not going to actually push whatever it's hitting. But the fireball, the explosion, yeah, that's going to have a physical effect. But the first thing is we got to set whatever our base damage is going to be. So the base damage is going to be based on a few different things. And the first thing is going to be the intensity of the ability. So we're going to get intensity. And I found that to get the optimal effect for this, we're going to divide by 10 because you got to keep in mind that every one of the particles of the flamethrower is going to be hitting. And that's going to be a lot of accumulated damage very quickly because it's going to be like 60 particles a second. And then the other thing is that I want the damage to be more intense the closer it is to the origin of the flamethrower. Meaning if that target is right up against the character's hands, like the character who's casting the flamethrower, whatever they're hitting, it's going to take a ton of damage very quickly. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide this. So divide, and that's going to be based on the distance here under the break hit result. So connect that up just like that. I'm going to put in a reroute. So think of it this way. So let's say the distance is 100, like 1 meter away. So the intensity is 100 as well. So 100 divided by 10 would be 10. 10 divided by 100, so it's only doing 0.1 damage, but it's doing 0.1 damage basically every single particle hit. And if there's 60 of those a second, it's doing 6 damage a second. And that's a meter away. So if they're half a meter away, then it's going to do double the damage. And over the course of this series, I'm sure we're going to be calibrating how much damage each ability does. That's like your typical patch notes of any game, but really it's ultimately up to you how you want this to play. So just showing you what I'm going with. So we're going to connect this up to base damage. And then we've got the hit from direction here. So how do we get that? Well, we have our trace start and our trace end. So I can drag it a pin from here and I can say get unit direction vector. And basically that's getting the direction between 2 points. And I can connect up the trace end to the 2. And then that's going to be our hit from direction. And once we got that, then we can collapse this break hit result here. Then I'm going to zoom out a little bit, make a little bit of space below because we're going to connect up our hit info and our event instigator and our damage causer. And while we're at it, let's also select the damage type class. So we have our new fire damage that we just created right there. So for the hit info here, we can just drag a pin from the out hit of our line trace by channel and connect that up, putting a little reroute right underneath the branch there. And then for the event instigator and damage causer, so what we can do is we can get a reference to our owner character, get owner character ref, and that's going to be our damage causer. And then the event instigator, from our owner character, we can get instigator controller, and then from that, connect that up. So the owner character is the damage causer. The owner character's controller is the event instigator, controller that was responsible for causing this damage. And I think this is only going to become relevant once we have like a free-for-all mode with multiple AI characters, but I fully intend to get there. And I'll just add a comment here, C, and we'll change this over to red. You know what this is doing. May need to rebalance Flamethrower damage multiplier in the future. And I'll just move this up just like that. The last thing I'm going to do here, just so we can test this, is come over to the left and we're going to do draw debug type for duration, just this one. So we'll compile and save our gameplay ability fire, go back over to BP third person character. And what I'm going to do is back in the event graph, I'm going to zoom out. We're going to make a little bit of space underneath event any damage. And down here, we could search for event point damage. But if we search for damage, scroll up to the top, then you'll see event point damage. And you heard me say that both of these are called. So I did some testing on this, and the event any damage is called before event point damage. But what I'm going to do with event point damage here, just for now, we're going to do two different print strings. So we're going to do a print string. Basically, we're going to verify that this up here is working, but we're going to verify that on the point damage itself, just to make sure this is being called. So from the end string here, we're going to do an append. You see me do this trick a bunch, but we're going to add to the append a plus sign here. And one more. So the A is going to be the point damage, and this is whatever damage we're passing into it. So I'll connect up our damage to the B. C, I'm just going to put in a comma and a space, and then the D, we're going to get our damage type and connect that up because I just want to make sure our new damage type is working. And then the second thing we're going to print, we're going to do a second print string over here. And this one is going to be our current health. So we can append again, and A is going to be current health, and B is going to be our actual health. So we can get our variable under health, current health, drag that in, get, connected up here. So if you got all this, so if you got the two different print strings, you are printing our point damage with the damage type, and then subsequently our current health there. Compile and save. So then in our actual level, we're going to go over to where our AI character is. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to raise up the fireball and the air ability channel temporarily, just so that he goes for the flamethrower first, and then we'll right click and play from here. When he picks it up, then V, reestablish his contact, and see a problem. So what's happening here? So if you look over by his hands, there are red squares. So what's actually happening is all of the decal line traces are hitting his own hands. And so we got to do the same thing that we did a few episodes ago, which is we need to specify the character, the owning character of the ability as an actor to ignore. So let's do that. So we could do it right here. We could do it in the fire decal update function, this actors to ignore right here. But in this case, we're just going to do it directly on our parent gameplay ability. So back in blueprints, gameplay abilities, and then this one right here. And if I zoom out on the event graph, so over here where we set our owner character ref and the ABP character ref, I'm just going to zoom out and move these over. Under references here, I'm going to get our owner character. And what we're going to do is we're going to make an array. Move these down here. In this array, I'm going to promote it to a variable. So right click, promote to variable, and I'm going to call this array the actors to ignore decal line trace. Ignore decal line trace. And we'll connect this up here. And by having this on the parent gameplay ability, then we can reference this variable on any gameplay ability. So compile and save this. Back in our gameplay ability fire. So back in our fire decal update function, we can right click and we can say get actors to ignore. And we're going to get actors to ignore decal line trace. And we'll connect this up here because the other line trace is for ignoring the ocean. So this one is just for the decal. So now we can compile and save this, and make sure you compile and save your parent gameplay ability, and we can test it one more time. So over to our AI and V. And as soon as he reestablishes contact, he should shoot the flamethrower. And you're going to see some other weird behavior here, but you'll see. See your damage printing over there on the left-hand side. Yeah, he took a lot of damage. But obviously there's a problem with the sound effect, right? It sounds like something out of an 80s arcade game. So let's see if we can fix that. So back in our third person character blueprint. So the way we're going to fix this is we're going to add an audio component to our third person character blueprint called vocalization. And vocalization is going to store whatever vocalization, whatever sound or conversation that character is doing at any given moment in time. And we're just going to check to see, okay, is that vocalization already playing? Is it valid? And if so, don't play a second vocalization because it doesn't make logical sense. So we're going to do add here, search for audio component, audio here, and we're going to name it vocalization. And then we have to go into the took damage sound effect function that we created back in episode 42. So this right here under receive damage. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to move these out a little bit. And right after we spawn sound attached, that's where we're going to set this to be the vocalization variable. So we can set vocalization right from there. And then we can connect it up just like this, and we're going to play the vocalization. And we can hold Alt, discontinue that. And I'm just going to copy this 2 more times down here, same sort of thing. Connect this one up here, connect this one there. So this is half of it. So this is setting when a sound begins to play, it's going to set vocalization. But now in the front half of this function, we need to check to see, okay, is vocalization already playing? Or at least, is it valid? So what we can do is get vocalization. First check to see, is it valid? Question mark. Done this a million times. Probably more like 1,000, but we've done this a lot. And actually, we're not going to connect up is valid to that branch. We're going to move this up a little bit. And we're going to connect it up to a different branch because if it's valid, we also want to check to see, okay, is it then playing? And then connect this up here. If it is playing, then do nothing. Only if it's not playing or if it's not valid, then go on and do something. So we can do a reroute. So if you got all that, and if it looks like this on the right, then you are all set. Compile and save. We could test one more time. So he's got the flamethrower. V just doesn't want to attack me. Here we go. Okay. Taking damage still, but only one sound at a time. And dead. But now let's take this to the next level, and that is if fire damage, if the flamethrower hits our character's head, that should do more damage than hitting a different part of the body, right? And you could do this for any part of the body, but we're just going to stick with the head for now. So let's go over how to do that. So let's first check to see what part of the body we're hitting. So back in the event graph on third person character. So down here with event point damage, we're going to add another pin, actually 2 more pins, because what we're going to do is we're going to do comma, and then we're going to get the bone name of whatever we're hitting. And that's one of the advantages to using event point damage. We don't have that ability on event any damage. We can't get the bone of what we're hitting. So we'll compile and save this, and we'll do one more test, and we'll see what bone we're hitting with the flamethrower. So we see some spine, clavicle, I see a head up there, and neck. And again. So we know we're able to hit specific bones with the point damage event, but we already talked about the fact that event any damage is already doing damage, right? So couldn't we do this? Couldn't we just have event point damage be sort of an additive damage system onto whatever the standard damage is from any damage? And we could do that based on specific bones that we get here. And I'm going to set this up only for the head, but you could set it up for whatever bones you want. So if you get hit right in the chest, if you wanted that to do more damage, then you could choose any of the spine bones and that'll do it. And that's why we collapsed the assess any damage to a function, because now we can call it a second time on event point damage here, and we can call it again for whatever bones we want to call it that second time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out all of this, and we're going to get our bone name here, and from here we're going to do a switch on name. And you could set as many of these pins as you want, but those pin names are going to be right up here. So plus sign, we're just going to do it for one, but I think you'll get the idea. So we're going to do it for the head. And where I'm getting these bone names, let me just show you that. So if you go into the mesh, go into your skeleton here. So it's all of these right here. So you could do it for spine 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you could have a damage multiplier that applies to any given one of these, but we're keeping it really simple. So we're just going to do additional damage for the head, double damage, and everything else is going to be status quo until we get to other types of damage potentially. But fire, just if your hair's on fire, trust me, that hurts. And we're not doing flammable hair this episode either. I shouldn't have gotten your hopes up. Okay, assess any damage. We're going to copy that, paste it down here. We're going to connect up head. And that's really it. So we can compile, save, and then because it's called twice, it's going to do damage twice as much. Close out of our Manny simple here, and we'll test. So if he gets hit in the face, it's going to do twice as much damage. But now let's test doing damage to our AI character. And so for that, we got to open up our AI character. Basically, I'm going to set him so that he can't run, can't hide, but we're not exposing him to anything that we're not doing to ourselves. So we're going to scroll down in the adversary AI character, character movement, and search for acceleration and change that back over to 0. We'll let him keep jumping around, but compile and save. And real quick, before we test over on gameplay ability fire in the fire decal update function in line trace by channel, I'm going to turn off the draw debug here, just so that we can see what's happening on our character. So we can get nice and close. Yeah, he's definitely taking damage. And we can see his facial expressions, jumping like a madman still, but he's damaged. So the last thing for cleanup before we go on to our explosion damage. So this fire decal update function, let's go back to the event graph. I realized we need to rename this function because it's no longer just doing fire decal updates. I'm going to rename it over here on the left-hand side, and we're going to rename it to fire damage update. And we'll compile and save this, and we are all set with our flamethrower. So now on to explosion damage. So for explosion damage, we're going to start in our third-person character. And I just want to talk about some of the other things on event point damage here, because we're going to end up using event point damage also for explosion damage, and I'll explain why. We have a few different variables here, like shot from direction, hit location, hit normal, that we're not using right now, but I anticipate that we will be using in the future. Because depending on where the attack is coming from, like shot from direction, that might determine how our AI is going to react, stuff like that. So although we're keeping these blank for now, I fully anticipate we're going to come back to them in the future. And I debated using, instead of point damage, radial damage for our fireball, event radial damage, but I found it wasn't necessary, especially in regard to how we're doing the explosion currently. So let's go back into the fireball, because I want to show you that. So content drawer, back over to content, blueprints, spawn from abilities over here, BP fireball. And if we go back over to the event graph, so back in episode 31, the explosion episode, we had on component hit, it spawned the explosion system, and it explodes the fireball here. And then over here on the right, the way it actually handles the explosion outward and figuring out what it's hitting is it does line traces in random directions, a random unit vector, and it's based on the intensity at explosion. And the reason I did it that way is because the performance is way better than doing a multi-sphere trace. But the end result of this in terms of the explosion damage is it's a little bit more varied, because in certain cases the fireball explosion might just hit with one of those traces, in other cases it could be 3 or 4 or 5. But to start, we still need to differentiate our explosion damage from other kinds of damage, because the explosion damage, well, there's a physical force there. It's physically going to push whatever it's hitting. And so we're going to go back to our content drawer. Under blueprints, we're going to go back to damage. Right click and we'll make a new blueprint class, and this one is also going to inherit from damage type, and this one is going to be explosion damage. And we'll go into that, but we're going to keep everything here exactly the same. Again, we're not really using this stuff yet, but totally fine keeping it as is. So we'll close out of that. So on our fireball, we have the same kind of thing where we do an existing decal check here. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the divide and the darken decal. We are going to move that up here. This one move up a little higher. And then back over in our gameplay ability fire damage update function, we're going to copy everything from cast to BP third person character down to here. So all of this, not the intensity, but all of this, we're going to copy all of that, come back over to BP Fireball, and then paste it in right over here. So Control V. And then if this cast fails, then it's going to go on to this. And it's going to take our hit actor, connect up to cast to BP third person character. Now we kept our intensity at explosion variable because this is what's going to be hooked up to the divide, but we're not going to divide it by 10 because the fireball is going to hit harder than the flamethrower. But keep in mind that the fireball, we're only having one fireball every 1 to 2 seconds, whereas the flamethrower, it's like every single particle that function is being called. So we'll delete this out and we'll connect this up directly to the divide, and then we'll expand break hit result here, get our distance, connect that up to the reroute. We'll also get our trace start, connect that up to get unit direction, same with the trace end. Collapse this. Instead of owner character reference, we got our third person character reference here, but you know what, I'm going to rename this because realistically it is the owner character reference, so we're just going to rename it to be exactly the same. And then this is just fine. Next, we're going to get our hit info from the out hit over here, connected up there, put in a reroute, me and my reroutes, maybe another reroute. And the reason we need intensity at explosion here instead of just intensity is, if you remember with the fireball, we're actually fading the fireball's intensity over time, like as it travels through space. And so the intensity is going down, and then when it actually explodes, it sets intensity at explosion based on this intensity, sets intensity back to 0. And the last thing here, under apply point damage, we got to switch this over to explosion damage. And I'm going to move these all out right there, and we'll give these a comment. character check and damage check. And compile and save this, and we are ready to test this as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to move up the flamethrower, move down the fireball right there, and away we go. Oh, I forgot to change his acceleration. Okay, back to our AI character, BP adversary AI character, back to our movement component. Allow him to walk again. Compile and save. And the very last thing before we test under BP Fireball, same kind of thing we did before. Let's just do a line trace so we can see what's happening for duration over here. Compile and save. Ready to test. So he picks up the Fireball. V. Here we go. And we see our line traces there. And sometimes they hit, sometimes they don't. And it's a little bit random. So what's happening is that the Fireball itself is hitting the capsule, and then the traces are actually hitting the character. And I tried setting the Fireball itself to hit the character and not the capsule, but it's actually a lot harder to hit then. I think I'm going to keep it so that the Fireball hits the capsule, and then the traces are hitting the actual bones, so that way we could do extra damage. But now the final part of the explosion damage, let's figure out how we can make the explosion damage do some knockback. And the knockback is going to do some damage, some extra damage in and of itself based on how much knockback actually occurs. So let's go back over to our third person character here. And we're not going to do any knockback for the head because it's already doing some extra damage there. And that's just going to kind of jerk the head back. And I played with it. I tried to actually get the head jerking back a little bit. It didn't look good. So if anyone comes up with a nice way of doing that, please post in the comments below or come on the Discord. But we're going to do that for all other cases where it doesn't hit the head. So from the default pin here, we are going to cast to explosion damage. And we're going to connect up our damage type just like this. Because basically what that's checking is if our damage type is explosion damage, then it's going to successfully do whatever's this pin here. And what this is going to be is add impulse. So add impulse, and that's going to be to our character movement component. So this right here, character movement. So I can move this down right here. And if you don't add the impulse to the character movement, it's not going to work properly. And then the impulse is going to be from damage. We're going to multiply this by 100. And after multiplying it by 100, then we're going to multiply again. And we're going to multiply to the shot from direction here. And what that's going to do is whatever direction we're shot from and where that's coming from is this right here, get unit direction, this hit from direction. That's then going to apply impulse to the character according to however much damage was taken. And then we can connect this up here. And the last thing here, just select the velocity change checkbox right there. And what this is going to do, this add impulse, so we're going to have velocity change damage right here, and we're going to be simulating physics with a character. And that's all based on episode 44 on physical animation. So if you got all that, that's looking good. Compile and save. And let's test this out. Let's actually fight our AI character. So I'm going to play from this fireball right here. And as soon as he picks up his and I pick up mine, away we go. V. So you should get some hits where immediately you notice you're getting pushed a little bit. Yeah, so if I'm falling like that, that means I'm getting pushed with the impulse. But if you're not seeing it to the extent that you want, so let's instead, we'll crank this up. Let's push it to 1,000. Compile and save. Let's try it again. Now you're seeing an effect. Oh yeah. Yeah, so that's maybe a little bit too much of an effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this to 200, but we are going to clamp the damage. So the damage is going to be clamped between, I'm going to do between 0 and 5. So no more than 5. And then we'll connect this up just like that. And feel free to play with this because you might find a better effect, but let's do that. So let's clamp it, multiply it by 200 for now, and we'll see what effect we get. Yeah, we still get some critical hits. You know, the damage, it's pretty random because of that. You know, we still can get some big hits of the fireball, and some hits that do absolutely nothing, other hits that do a lot. So I think it's a lot more random, honestly, than your typical game, but I kind of like it. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below, but I want it to be somewhat unpredictable, the game that we're making, but you still got to hit your target for it to have any effect. Last thing on this, I'm going to clamp this to 3 here, because otherwise the damage seemed to be a little bit excessive at times. But like I said, feel free to play with it. Compile and save. And although I didn't see it while I was recording this episode, there's another issue that you might run into. You might notice it with your adversary AI character, where even when he gets knocked back and he's fallen, like he's fallen on the ground, he still is able to jump up in the air even though he's in that fallen state. So let's fix that. So if we navigate back to our content drawer, content core, into our animation blueprint, and if I zoom out, so back in episode 41, we set up fall damage and effects, and then we refine that for the AI. It's this anim notify hard landing straight down, hard landing roll. We've got this AI disable controller input, but I found that these were not actually working. Like I said, the AI could still jump. Now maybe these controlled whether or not it could move, but they weren't controlling whether or not it could jump. And so the easiest way I found to fix this is what we're going to do is move these over a little bit. We're going to disconnect these pins here, because what we're going to do is we're going to get our third person character reference. So under references, third person character, and we're going to cast to BP adversary AI character. And that's going to basically check to see, okay, is it an adversary AI character? Because if it is, what we're going to do is we are going to pause timer by function name, and we're going to pause the attack check, and we're going to pause the jump and movement check. So attack check, and you want to make sure to get these function names verbatim. So these are under BP adversary AI character, this right here, attack check, and under AI movement, the jump and movement check function. So same sort of thing. We'll duplicate this, and then this second one is going to be jump and movement check, just like that, connected up. These over here, I'm going to move over further still, and then I'm going to take these and paste them down below. And it's also going to be in this string here, and this is going to be connected up here. And then down here, we're going to do the same thing, but this is the hard landing recovery. And this is where we're going to also cast, but we're going to unpause those timers. So from here, unpause timer by function name, and also make sure to connect as BP adversary AI character here, and this one over here. Forgot to do that. Copy and paste this again. We're going to do the same thing. Connect this one up here, and copy and paste these function names. So attack check, jump, and movement check, and then connect this up here. So what these are doing is it's basically saying, okay, if you go into a hard landing roll, then pause the attack check function and the jump and movement check function, pause those. But then once it recovers, so connect this up here for the recovery. Once it recovers, then we can unpause those two functions. And there's one last thing I forgot to do here. So cast failed. If this is not adversary AI character, go back there, put in a reroute, and same thing for this cast failed. And it's not an adversary AI character, connect it up and put in a reroute. So make sure if it's not an adversary AI character, it still does this, still does that. So we're going to collapse these to a function by the end of the episode. Compile and save. So to test this on our AI specifically, what I recommend doing is navigate over to third person character and crank this up just for now. So maybe max of 20. And you know, for some reason, whenever I was testing this out on our adversary AI character, I had a much harder time getting any sort of impulse effect on him. And I don't know why that is. So if you know what I'm doing wrong here, please post in the comments below. Whenever I got his health down pretty low and he wasn't moving very quickly, then it had an effect, but that was the only circumstance. And I bet there's something really minor that I'm missing here. So like I said, if you could help me out, I'd appreciate it. So compile and save this, and then what you'll see when we test this out, when we hit our AI and our AI falls down, then it shouldn't jump up again. And I recommend testing this even without hitting B, like just as our AI is running here. Get his health down pretty low, and then you can see him start to fall. Yeah, so you see him get launched up like that. And then he's not jumping up until he's back up on his feet. But again, I had to crank up the effects significantly in order to get our AI character acting the way our third person character does normally. So to end the episode, as always, cleanup time. So let's go back to our third person character. And you know what? I think what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to keep the clamp here 0 to 5. And I might revisit that in the future, but I think that will suffice for now. And we'll come over here, and I think I actually added this in between recordings. So I was just testing out what kind of impulse it was adding, but it was effectively adding the impulse. So delete that out if you still have any print strings. So your event point damage should look like this. Your event any damage should be collapsed to this function. So compile and save our third person character. We'll go back to our BP fireball, and we're also going to turn off our for duration draw debug on the line trace by channel here. So select none, compile and save our BP fireball. And the last thing, over to our ABP third person character. So we're going to collapse both of these to a function. So this function is the same as this, but this one is different because we're unpausing the timer here. So we'll select these three up here, right click, collapse to function. And this one we're going to title rename pause AI timers. And I'm going to categorize that under AI character here. And then we're going to take that function, duplicate it, and actually I can delete out all of this now. and connect it up just like this. And then from here, connect it up over here. Zoom out, move in all of these nodes. Move these into there. And then we're going to select these three and collapse them to a function. But first we got to delete out this, and then we can select them three and say collapse to function. And this one is going to be right click, rename unpause AI timers. And that's also going to be categorized under AI character. And I'll move in these nodes over to the left. And if we go into each of those functions, just make sure they look okay. That looks solid. Compile and save. Over to the unpause AI timers, same thing. And just for funsies, if you want to go back to your third person character, do one last test, you can crank this up to some really high value. Like let's do 50, compile and save. And you remember the scene in Boondock Saints, the original, where he said, "It was a firefight." We could have a firefight. So right click, play from here. And then V. I think the green in the outer edges of my screen means I'm dead, but we're going to cover that next episode. So guys, I know we set up the explosion damage to be pretty random. It could do just about nothing, and it could do a ton of damage. And I know that's atypical for most games. Most games, it's like the user, the player of the game, they expect a standard amount of damage for every ability. And we're doing something a little bit different because we have that creative freedom with what we're doing. So experiment. I'm really interested to know what you're coming up with in the comments below. And the very last thing we'll do is tone down our clamp here. So back down to 5, compile and save. One very last thing, guys. If we come back into the BP Fireball, zoom out, come over here on the left-hand side in the event graph. So basically right here where we're doing the line traces outwards, what I found, and this was just through a lot of trial and error, that if we made this a little bit longer, so half a meter longer, from 50 to 100, it had a better effect in terms of reaching its target, whatever's close by, to actually apply damage. So after you set that, just compile and save. So that concludes our episode for today. And in our next episode, dying properly. So I hope to see you there.